All right, so now we've done a supertype, subtype overview. We're now going to talk about specialization and generalization. And these are not topics unrelated to supertype, subtypes. In fact, these actually have to do with the process by which you might end up with a supertype, subtype. So the definition of specialization is the process of defining one or more subtypes of the supertype and forming supertype-subtype relationships. So in other words, this is a process by which you might have an entity and you determine that that entity doesn't actually meet your needs in terms of specialization. Like that entity might have different permutations or different variations that would be better suited as having more specialized, and that's why they call it specialization, subtypes. So here's an example. Let's say that we start with an entity called part, right? And it has all the usual attributes we might ascribe to a part. We have a part number, a description, a quantity, a location, and we also have a part routing number, right? And we have a part supplier. Or as it's multi-valued, we have more than one part supplier, perhaps. But let's say that we determine, actually, that we have both manufactured parts, right, and purchased parts, right? And so for the manufactured parts, we do have a routing number, but for purchased parts, we actually don't have a routing number. For purchased parts, we have a supplier, but for the manufactured parts, we don't have a supplier. So this is an example of why we might want specialization. As you can see, what we've done is we've taken the common attributes that both manufactured parts and purchased parts have, right? The part number, description, location, and quantity, because those apply to both. And we've moved those into the part supertype. But now we've created two subtypes, manufactured part and purchased part, right? Manufactured part only has a routing number in addition to the attributes up here in the part supertype. And the purchase part actually has no specific attributes that only apply to the purchase part, but what it does have is a relationship to supplies, actually to supplier through supplies, right? Which is not something that's necessary for the manufactured part. So this is an example of specialization. You start with the supertype essentially, and you derive essentially, or you specialize subtypes out of that supertype. So here's another example of the same thing, right? Let's say that we started with an event, okay? Let's say we're starting from scratch and we create an event entity. And at first we just have an event ID, a name and description. We're keeping it really simple, right? And then someone comes to us and says, hey, some of these events, specifically weddings, for instance, we also need a way of identifying the photographer and the cake type, right? And so we say, okay, we'll just add those attributes to the event. Right? Now, not all events, of course, necessarily have a photographer and a cake type, but since some of them do, let's throw the attribute in event, and for those that don't, we'll just leave it blank, right? But then someone else, someone on the sporting side comes and says, hey, we also have sporting events, and we need to know the sport type. We need to know if it's a basketball or a baseball or pickleball or whatever it happens to be, right? And so we add that attribute to event as well. But now we see how this is not going to scale, because some of the events, let's say that it was simply like a birthday party, wouldn't necessarily have a photographer, a cake type, a sport type. Well, they probably would have a cake type, but they wouldn't have all these attributes. And so more and more what we end up seeing is that many of these attributes end up being blank for many of the events. And so that's not a really great way to have a bunch of just blank fields in our entity instances. So what we do is first we identify which of these attributes are common to all events and which are specific to one or more subtypes. So in this, again, it's a simple example. So we say event ID, name, and description are common, right? We say the photographer and the cake type are specific to weddings, right? And the sport type is specific to sporting events. Now, you don't actually have to do this notation. You don't have to write out which ones are common in wedding. I'm just showing you the process, right? So from here, what we do is we basically create the supertype event, right? All the common attributes go to event, and all of the attributes that are specific to weddings go to weddings, and all the attributes specific to sporting types or sporting events go to sporting events. Now, what I haven't done here is show how relationships, and you saw that in the previous example, how a relationship, we might have had, let's say that for the event we said, okay, sporting events also have tickets, so let's create a relationship to tickets, but that would only apply to sporting events, right? And so in the same way that we distributed the attributes, we would then move that sporting type or that ticket, relationship down to the sporting event, right? And again, in the previous example, you kind of saw how a relationship would move. And so because of the way that specialization works, we often call it sort of a top-down approach. That is to say, you're starting with the top, the supertype, right, at the very top, and you're moving down, creating subtypes. So once you have the concept of specialization down, generalization is actually just kind of the inverse of that. So the definition of generalization is the process of defining a more general entity type from a set of more specialized entity types. So really it's just the converse of what we've just seen. In this situation, you have some entities and you realize there's a lot of commonality between them. And you say, hey, maybe these are subtypes. We can come up with a common supertype. So here's the example. Let's say that you came up with the entities car, truck, and motorcycle, right? And then on review, you realize, hey, they all have a vehicle ID, they all have a price, they all have an engine displacement, and they all have a vehicle name. Now, sure, there are a couple little differences, like cars have numbers of passengers, trucks have capacity, and motorcycles don't have either of those two things, right? But there's a lot of commonality. And so what can we do with that? Let's create a vehicle supertype. Right, and we can see that what we've done is we've moved all of the common attributes, vehicle ID, price, engine displacement, up into the supertype, right? Vehicles of all types, including motorcycles, which have no unique attributes or relationships, have all these attributes, right? So cars and trucks and motorcycles as well. Now, motorcycles is kind of a special case, and we'll deal with that later in the topic of completeness, but for now, kind of set that aside. And so here's another example, right? So here we're going to use the event example again. And let's say that we started with 3 event types, and again, we're starting not from the sense of we already have a supertype and subtypes, but we just created some new entities. We had a sporting event entity, a wedding entity, and a birthday entity, right? And they're a little bit different, right? Now, all of them have a common relationship to venue. They all happen in a venue, right? All of them have the common attributes, event ID, name, and description, right? But they also have some different attributes, right? And sporting event has its own relationship to an entity called ticket, because you're selling tickets to sporting events. So you see there's some difference, but you say, hey, there's enough commonality here. Let's take a look at how much commonality there is. And so here I've highlighted in green the common attributes, right? Event ID, name, and description, as well as the common relationship, venue, right? And red are the things that are specific to one or more of these entities, right? Red things do not apply to all entities, right? So you do have cake type in both wedding and birthdays, but since they don't apply to sporting events, they're still considered, sort of specific. So what do we do with that? Kind of the same thing, right? We take the common attributes, we turn them into an event supertype. We take the common relationship, venue, and we apply that relationship at the supertype level. That's why venue is up here. The things that are specific to the subtypes, we leave alone. So sporting event still contains, sport type and level. Wedding still contains photographer and cake type. And the sporting event also has its own relationship to ticket, because none of the other subtypes had that. And that's, in a nutshell, specialization and generalization. So now we're going to talk about completeness constraints. And again, this topic has to do with supertypes and subtypes. It's not a completely divorced, unrelated topic. So a completeness constraint, the definition, is a type of constraint that addresses whether an instance of a supertype must also be a member of at least one subtype. Okay? Whether an instance of a supertype must also be a member of at least one subtype. And we actually just saw an example that kind of illustrates this. And so we have 2 rules in the completeness constraint, or 2 possibilities. One is called the total specialization rule. The definition is a rule that specifies that each entity instance of a supertype must be a member of some subtype in that relationship. Okay? It's represented as a double line between the supertype and the circle. So we've seen a single line here before, but for total specialization, we have a double line. And what we see here is, remember how motorcycle, in one of the previous examples, because it had no attributes of its own and no relationships of its own, it essentially was this empty box, right, with no relationship. Now, under total specialization, you still represent this empty box, right, essentially, because every entity instance, right, you have to define as either, that's a vehicle, you have to define it as a car or a truck or a motorcycle. That's total specialization, right? You cannot say some things are cars, some things are trucks, and then some other things are vehicles. Total specialization means that every instance you have of an entity, when you define it, must be at least one of the subtypes. We're going to deal with whether it can be more than one subtype later. But total specialization means that it has to be at least one of the subtypes, right? An entity instance cannot be of type vehicle, so the entity instance cannot be the supertype. The partial specialization rule definition is that a rule that specifies an entity instance of a supertype is allowed not to belong to any subtype. Okay, so here it's represented as a single line. So you may realize this is actually the default. Partial specialization is the default. You know that generally when we've represented supertype and subtypes, we have a single line between the supertype and the circle, right? So by default, you have a partial specialization. And what that means is essentially, if you wanted to define a car, right, a Ford Focus or whatever, you would make it as an entity instance of the car, right? If you wanted a Ford F-150, you would make it an entity instance of a truck. Now, if you had a motorcycle, right, because we don't have a motorcycle here, you would make it as an instance of a vehicle, right? Partial specialization allows you to basically define something as the supertype itself, okay? And that's really the only difference. And that's the entirety of the completeness constraint right there, really. Total specialization, every entity instance must be of a type of subtype, must be a subtype. It cannot be the supertype. Okay, total cannot be the supertype. Partial specialization, it can be the supertype, or it can be a subtype, or it can be more than one, and as we're going to deal with in the next set of slides, disjointness constraints.